The missiles were already in position. Iranian military commanders had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. They knew which American bases to hit. They knew the precise timing windows when defenses would be thinnest. They knew the layout of the facilities, the location of the aircraft, the supply lines, the vulnerabilities. They knew because someone had told them. 12 someones. All of them inside the Pentagon. All of them with active security clearances. All of them passing classified documents to Iranian intelligence handlers for cash. The attack was 8 days away, and the people planning it were confident. They had the best intelligence Iran had ever obtained on American military operations. Strike routes, target packages, operational timelines. The internal political debates about when and whether America would move first against Iran's nuclear program. They had everything, except one thing. They didn't know that 6 months earlier, a routine algorithm had flagged a single database query inside a Pentagon classified system. A civilian analyst was accessing files that had nothing to do with his job. That flag triggered a surveillance operation. The surveillance operation exposed a network. The network led back to Tehran, and what the FBI discovered in the months that followed would force a decision that had no margin for error and no room for delay. 8 days. 0 mistakes allowed. But before any of that, before the arrests, before the war rooms, before the back-channel calls to Tehran, it started with something so small most investigators would have dismissed it entirely. A database query from a man who had no business making it. January 2024, Washington, D.C. Inside a government server room nobody ever thinks about, an automated system was doing what it always does. Scanning, comparing, flagging. The Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency runs continuous monitoring across Pentagon classified networks, thousands of access points, millions of queries, most of them routine. This one was not. A civilian analyst in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy had been pulling classified documents at an unusual rate. His job was narrow. He assessed how regional conflicts in the Middle East affected oil markets and energy supply chains. Important work, but specific. His database queries told a completely different story. Over 8 months, he had accessed 347 classified documents with no connection to energy policy. Military strike assessments, operational timelines, intelligence estimates on Iranian air defense systems, target vulnerability analyses for facilities deep inside Iran. Natanz, Fordow, Parchin, the 3 crown jewels of Iran's nuclear program. And this analyst had been reading everything the Pentagon knew about destroying them. The flag went to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division the same week. Here is what made it worse. This wasn't a new employee. This was someone who had passed multiple background investigations. Someone who had held a security clearance for years without a single incident. Someone the system had already decided to trust. That trust had been catastrophically misplaced. FBI surveillance teams were deployed within days. Financial records were subpoenaed. Phone communications were placed under court-authorized monitoring. A physical surveillance rotation was established around his home, his commute, his office building. What they expected to find was one corrupt analyst selling secrets for money. What they actually found was the edge of something far larger. Because within 2 weeks of watching him, surveillance teams documented something that changed the entire scope of the investigation. He wasn't working alone. And the person he was meeting, the man across the table at a coffee shop in Arlington every few weeks, was not who he claimed to be. Not even close. The coffee shop was chosen carefully. Corner location, multiple exits. Enough foot traffic to make 2 men sitting together completely invisible. Close enough to the Pentagon to be convenient. Far enough from it to feel safe. The man who chose it knew exactly what he was doing. He had entered the United States 3 years earlier on a business visa. His cover was clean. He presented himself as a consultant for a European defense technology firm. He had business cards, a company website, a LinkedIn profile with a carefully constructed professional history. None of it was real. FBI investigators identified him as an operational officer assigned to the IRGC's Foreign Operations Directorate. His actual mission had nothing to do with European defense contracts. He had been sent to Washington with one specific objective: recruit Americans with Pentagon access, build a network. feed Tehran everything it needed to prepare for a potential military confrontation with the United States. He was exceptionally good at his job. His recruitment approach followed a methodology Iranian intelligence had refined over decades. He didn't approach targets cold. He studied them first. LinkedIn profiles of Pentagon employees were harvested systematically. Financial stress indicators were mapped. Divorce records, property liens, credit activity, medical expenses. He was looking for pressure points. Once a target was identified, the approach was slow. A professional introduction at a conference, a follow-up email, a lunch meeting that felt entirely legitimate. Months of relationship building before money was ever mentioned. By the time a target realized what was happening, they were already in too deep to walk away. The original analyst had been recruited this way, approached at an energy policy conference, cultivated over 8 months, offered what was framed as a consulting arrangement with a private firm seeking competitive intelligence on American defense priorities. He told himself it wasn't really espionage. The handler had heard that before. He knew exactly how long that particular story lasted once the money started coming in. 14 meetings, 14 envelopes, $15,000 each time. Over 2 years, the analyst had received more than $200,000 in cash. But the handler wasn't running just one analyst. He never had been. And the FBI was about to find out exactly how wide his network had spread inside the building across the river. 12 people. That was the final count. 12 separate individuals inside the Pentagon who had been recruited, developed, and activated by Iranian intelligence over 5 years. When FBI investigators mapped the full network, it didn't look like a conspiracy. It looked like a staffing chart. The 12 compromised individuals had been selected with surgical precision. Each one filled a specific intelligence gap. Together, they gave Iran a complete picture of American military planning that no single source could have provided alone. 4 were civilian intelligence analysts. They had direct access to classified assessments of Iranian military capabilities and American operational planning. They could read the documents that described exactly how the United States intended to fight a war against Iran and what it expected Iran to do in response. 3 were defense contractors working on systems integration projects. Their access was technical, weapon specifications, performance parameters, the capabilities and limitations of the systems that American forces would actually use in a strike. One of these contractors had been the highest earner in the network. Over 3 years, he had received $340,000. His neighbors noticed the new car. His wife noticed the home renovations. Nobody asked the right questions. 2 were administrative personnel in sensitive offices. Their value wasn't documents, it was schedules, meeting logs, internal communications. They could tell Iran who was meeting with whom, when decisions were being made, and which conversations were happening off the record. 2 were IT specialists with access to classified networks. This is where it gets particularly dangerous. Their job wasn't just to steal data. It was to make sure nobody noticed the data was being stolen. They understood the audit systems. They knew which access patterns triggered flags and which ones didn't. They had been actively helping other network members avoid detection for years. 1 was a budget analyst. His intelligence was different in nature but equally valuable. Defense spending patterns reveal strategic priorities. Procurement timelines signal operational readiness. A country preparing to strike moves money in specific ways. Iran had been reading those movements in real time. All 12 had passed background investigations. All 12 had maintained active security clearances. All 12 had been operating inside one of the most secure buildings on Earth without triggering a single alert for years. How? The answer is uncomfortable. Background investigations at the time were backlogged by months, sometimes years. Financial monitoring was constrained by privacy regulations. Access controls were built for efficiency, not suspicion. The underlying assumption across the entire system was that cleared personnel were trustworthy by definition. That assumption had been exploited deliberately and methodically. But the damage wasn't just institutional. What these 12 people had actually handed to Iran over 5 years wasn't just a collection of classified documents. It was a complete blueprint for how to survive an American attack and how to strike back before one could be launched. Put yourself in a room in Tehran. You are an IRGC military planner. On the table in front of you are 3 years of intelligence gathered from inside the Pentagon itself, not intercepts, not satellite imagery, not open-source analysis, primary source documents, written by the people planning the strikes, describing exactly what they intended to do. What do you now know? You know the targets. Natanz, where Iran enriches uranium in underground centrifuge halls, buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete. Fordow, built inside a mountain specifically to survive conventional airstrikes. Parchin, the military complex where weapons development work has been conducted for decades. American planners had assessed all three, identified approach vectors, calculated the munitions required, estimated the probability of successful destruction. Iran had read every word of that assessment. You know the strike routes, the specific flight corridors that American aircraft and cruise missiles would follow to reach those targets, the timing windows when Iranian radar coverage had gaps, the moments when American forces would be most exposed during ingress and egress. You know the vulnerabilities, which American bases in the region were most dependent on single supply lines, which defensive systems had response time limitations, which facilities housed the largest concentrations of personnel and equipment. You know the politics, the internal deliberations about what would trigger a decision to strike, the diplomatic red lines, the constraints that limited the scope of any potential military action, the timeline pressures that might force a decision faster than Iran expected, and most critically, you know that a strike might be coming within 60 days. That last piece of intelligence had arrived in September 2024. Updated strike planning options developed in response to Iran's accelerating nuclear program. The documents confirmed that American military planners were actively preparing options. Political conditions were tightening. Diplomatic channels were narrowing. The window for Iran to act first was closing. This is the intelligence that changed everything, because Iran's response wasn't to negotiate. It wasn't to pause its nuclear program. It wasn't to seek a diplomatic off-ramp. Iran's response was to prepare a preemptive strike of its own, using the intelligence provided by the Pentagon network to target American forces at their most exposed moments. Missiles pre-positioned, drone swarms assembled, proxy networks in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen placed on activation orders. The plan was designed to be devastating and simultaneous. American bases across the Middle East hit all at once, before any strike on Iran could be launched. Thousands of American service members in the target zone, 8 days away. But there was something Iran's planners didn't know. The network had already been found. The moment the FBI intercepted the September intelligence package, everything changed. Up until that point, Operation Persian Betrayal had been a counterintelligence investigation, methodical, patient, building a prosecutable case against 12 individuals who had betrayed their country for cash. It became something else entirely, a race. FBI counterintelligence leadership briefed senior officials at the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense within hours of the intercept. The briefings were held in compartmented facilities. Attendance was restricted to a small number of cleared personnel. What was said in those rooms has never been fully disclosed. What is known is the conclusion they reached. Iran was not waiting to see whether America would strike first. Iran had decided to move preemptively, and the intelligence that had enabled that decision had come directly from inside the Pentagon. The planned attack had a specific architecture. IRGC missile batteries had been repositioned to cover American installations in Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. These were not symbolic targets. These were the forward operating bases where American aircraft, logistics networks, and command infrastructure were concentrated. Drone swarms were being prepared. The same drone technology Iran had been supplying to proxy forces across the region for years, now being massed for a coordinated simultaneous launch. Proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen were receiving activations signals, sleeper cells, pre-positioned weapons caches, militia commanders waiting for a single encrypted message. The attack was designed to overwhelm American defensive systems through sheer simultaneity. Too many threats, too many directions, too many targets at once. Internal American military assessments of the potential casualty figures from such an attack were not made public. They didn't need to be. The bases targeted housed thousands of American service members. The attack was designed to be catastrophic, not just militarily, but politically. A devastating strike on American forces before any action against Iran would reframe the entire confrontation in Iran's favor internationally, and they had 8 days to execute it. Here is the part that makes this moment genuinely extraordinary. The FBI could not simply arrest the 12 Pentagon insiders and call it resolved. An arrest wave would alert Iranian handlers within hours. Once Tehran knew the network was burned, attack timelines would accelerate, not decelerate. Iran might launch immediately rather than risk losing the intelligence advantage. Arresting the network could trigger the very attack it was meant to prevent. But leaving the network in place for even one more day risked additional intelligence reaching Tehran. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. The people in those compartmented briefing rooms had to solve an equation that had no clean answer. They had 72 hours to figure out how, and the plan they developed was unlike anything the FBI had executed before. The plan had 4 phases. Each one had to work perfectly. Each one depended on the ones before it, and all of them had to be set in motion within 72 hours without any of the 12 targets realizing what was coming. Phase 1 was the arrests. All 12 individuals taken simultaneously, not sequentially, not one at a time as evidence allowed. All 12 at the same moment, in different locations before any single one of them could send a warning message to their handlers. A 2-minute gap between the first and last arrest was considered too wide. The coordination required was exceptional. Phase 2 was military repositioning. Immediately following the arrests, commanders at American bases across the Middle East would receive encrypted orders. Aircraft dispersed, defensive systems moved, personnel relocated to hardened facilities. Alert levels elevated across the board. The movements had to appear routine. Normal operational adjustments, nothing that would signal specific intelligence awareness to Iranian surveillance. But the adjustments had to fundamentally alter the target picture that Iranian planners were working from. Every target package Iran held needed to become invalid within hours of the arrests. Phase 3 was diplomatic. A back-channel message would be delivered to Iranian leadership through Swiss intermediaries, the standard communication pathway between Washington and Tehran, given the absence of direct diplomatic relation. The message was calibrated with precision. It would confirm that the Pentagon network had been compromised. It would make clear that Iranian intelligence on American force dispositions was no longer accurate, and it would deliver an unambiguous warning about the consequences of proceeding with any attack. The goal was not to reassure Iran. The goal was to create uncertainty, to make Iranian military planners question every assumption their attack plan was built on. An army paralyzed by doubt does not launch missiles. Phase 4 targeted the handler network directly. The Iranian intelligence officers who had built and run the Pentagon penetration were still operating inside the United States. 6 of them, running under commercial and diplomatic covers. They would be arrested simultaneously with the Pentagon insiders, removing any possibility of operational continuity or emergency communication to Tehran. 4 phases, 12 arrests, 6 intelligence officers, military repositioning across 5 countries. A diplomatic back-channel message to one of America's most dangerous adversaries, all of it launching at 5 in the morning on a Tuesday. The margin for error across the entire operation was effectively 0. 1 phone call from any of the 12 targets. 1 suspicious movement spotted by Iranian surveillance. 1 leak from the small circle of officials who had been briefed. Any of those things and the attack timeline accelerates. Tuesday morning, 5 a.m. The teams were already moving. 5 a.m. Tuesday. 12 locations. 12 FBI tactical teams. 12 targets who went to sleep the night before with no idea the morning would end their lives as they knew them. In Alexandria, the original analyst was lacing up his running shoes when the knock came. He had a routine. Early morning jog along the Potomac. Coffee before work. 30 years of ordinary life built around a government salary that had quietly been supplemented by more than $200,000 in Iranian cash. He opened the door. It was not a good morning for a run. In Arlington, an IT specialist was pulling on her jacket when agents met her in the parking garage of her apartment complex. The technical equipment found in her apartment later told a specific story. Devices engineered to extract data from classified networks without leaving audit trails. Tools that had been actively used to help other network members avoid the very monitoring systems she was supposed to maintain. In Bethesda, a defense contractor was arrested in his kitchen. His wife was standing at the counter. His children were eating breakfast. The new car in the driveway and the recently renovated kitchen had been paid for with $340,000 in Iranian intelligence funds. His wife later told investigators she had noticed the money but accepted his explanation that a series of private consulting contracts had been unusually lucrative. She had never asked for documentation. By 6:30 a.m., all 12 were in custody. Not one had managed to send a warning. The interrogations began within hours. FBI agents walked in carrying months of surveillance. Photographs from the Arlington coffee shop meetings. Financial records showing every cash deposit, every unexplained transfer, every lifestyle upgrade that salary alone could not explain. Forensic analysis of personal devices that had already been imaged covertly during the investigation. The question was never whether the evidence was sufficient. It was what additional damage had occurred that surveillance had missed. Several defendants tried to maintain cover stories. The original analyst claimed he genuinely believed he was working for a legitimate European defense firm. Intercepted communications destroyed that claim within the first hour. Messages showed explicit references to IRGC recipients and Iranian handlers by name. A contractor insisted the information he passed was unclassified. Forensic analysis of his devices found documents marked secret and top secret. Others broke immediately. Faced with the weight of the evidence and the reality of potential death penalty charges, several defendants began providing detailed cooperation within the first 24 hours. Handler meeting locations, communication protocols, payment mechanisms, and critically, a full accounting of every document category they had transmitted over the life of their recruitment. The cooperation confirmed what the damage assessment had already begun to reveal. The breach was historic in its scope. Only 2 defendants chose to fight the charges at trial. Both were convicted on all counts. Sentences across the group ranged from 25 years to life in federal prison. 2 received death sentences. Both were later commuted to life without the possibility of parole. But the arrests were only half the operation. Across the Middle East, American forces were already moving. Within hours of the last arrest, encrypted orders went out to American military commanders across the Middle East. The orders did not explain why. They did not reference Iranian spy networks or compromised intelligence packages. They described routine operational adjustments, normal force management decisions of the kind that happen regularly without announcement. But the adjustments were anything but routine. At bases in Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, the specific installations Iranian planners had targeted, aircraft were dispersed to secondary positions. Fuel and munition stores were redistributed. Personnel were moved from primary housing facilities to hardened structures. Defensive missile batteries were repositioned to cover approach vectors that Iranian strike planners had identified as optimal. Every move was designed to invalidate a specific element of the Iranian attack plan. The parking aprons that Iranian target packages identified as aircraft concentration points were empty within 12 hours. The command facilities that IRGC planners had prioritized were either vacated or reinforced beyond the damage thresholds the attack had been calculated to achieve. Iran's attack plan had been built on intelligence that was now 3 days old and completely wrong. The back-channel message reached Tehran through Swiss intermediaries on the same day as the arrests. The Swiss have maintained a protecting power relationship between Washington and Tehran since 1980. Communications that cannot travel through normal diplomatic channels travel through burn. The message was precise and deliberately unsettling. It confirmed the network had been compromised. It confirmed that Iranian intelligence on American force dispositions was no longer valid. It stated clearly that any military action against American installations would be met with a response of overwhelming scale. What it did not confirm was how much Iran's intelligence had been degraded, or which specific elements of their planning remained accurate. That ambiguity was intentional. Iranian military commanders now faced a decision with no good options. Proceed with an attack built on intelligence they knew was compromised but couldn't fully assess. Delay while attempting to rebuild their intelligence picture from scratch, or stand down entirely and absorb the loss of a 5-year penetration operation. The paralysis set in almost immediately. CIA and allied intelligence services, including assessments shared by Israeli intelligence, which had been monitoring IRGC force movements independently, confirmed that Iranian attack preparations began to stall within 48 hours of the message being delivered. Missile battery repositioning stopped, drone assembly timelines extended, proxy force activation signals went quiet, the 8-day window closed, and then something remarkable happened. Nothing. No missiles, no drone swarms, no coordinated assault across 5 countries. The thousands of American service members at those bases went about their duties. Morning briefings, maintenance rotations, meals in dining facilities that had been quietly identified as primary casualty zones 8 days earlier. They never knew. Not one of them received a briefing about what had been planned for them. Not one family was told how close a casualty of a notification visit had come. That is how prevention works. The attack that was stopped left no wreckage, no memorial, no count of the lives it didn't take. But the story wasn't finished, not by a long way. The damage assessment took months. Teams of intelligence analysts worked through every document that had been compromised, every classified assessment that had been photographed and passed across a coffee shop table in Arlington. Every technical specification that had been extracted from a Pentagon system by an IT specialist who knew exactly how to avoid leaving traces. What they found placed this case alongside the worst intelligence betrayals in American history. Robert Hanssen, the FBI agent who spent 22 years feeding classified information to Soviet and Russian intelligence, caught in 2001, died in prison in 2023. Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer whose betrayal led directly to the identification and execution of Soviet assets working for American intelligence, arrested in 1994, still serving life without parole. Jonathan Pollard, the naval intelligence analyst who sold American secrets to Israel, served 30 years before release. The Pentagon penetration belonged in that company. Strike options against Iranian nuclear facilities had to be completely redesigned, not updated. Redesigned from the beginning on the assumption that everything Iran knew about the previous plans remained valid in Tehran's files indefinitely. Operational security protocols across the entire defense establishment were rebuilt. Years of intelligence collection pointing to human sources inside Iran, sources whose identities could be inferred from the specificity of the documents that had been stolen, were now at catastrophic risk. Some of those sources were never heard from again. That detail has never been publicly confirmed. It likely never will be. The reforms that followed were significant. Continuous evaluation systems replaced periodic reinvestigation for personnel with access to sensitive programs. Financial monitoring thresholds were lowered. Anomaly detection algorithms were upgraded across classified database systems. Compartmentalization was tightened to limit access strictly to demonstrable operational need. The vulnerabilities that had allowed 12 people to operate undetected for 5 years were documented, analyzed, and partially addressed. Partially. Because the fundamental tension that made the penetration possible has not been resolved. Background investigations still carry backlogs. Financial monitoring is still constrained by privacy considerations. The cleared workforce is still vast, and the resources dedicated to monitoring it are still finite. Somewhere in the Washington metropolitan area right now, an Iranian intelligence officer is running a recruitment operation against a government employee. The approach has already started. The relationship is already being built. The pressure point has already been identified. That is not speculation. That is the documented operational pattern of a foreign intelligence service that invested 5 years and significant resources in a penetration that came within 8 days of triggering a regional war. They learned from what went wrong. The question is whether the people watching for the next network learned faster. One analyst, one database query, one algorithm flag on a quiet January morning. That is what stood between 8 days and catastrophe. And right now, somewhere in a government building that most people walk past without a second thought, someone is sitting at a desk, accessing files they have no business reading, wondering if anyone is watching.